Good morning, everyone. It's the 15th of February. I've been reading through this book, Phillips versus the State of Missouri. It's the account of my termination as a social worker for refusing to license homosexuals as foster parents and place children with homosexuals. I'm ready for Chapter 10, and this is about the federal trial. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and do his good pleasure. Philippians 2:13. Well, the first time I walked in the new federal building in Kansas City, Missouri. Going through security, entering this massive structure with all the federal judges and everything associated with it made me realize for the first time that this case was no small matter. As I entered into the plaintiff's room, I observed in the courtroom over 40 prospective jurors being interviewed and screened for my case against the state of Missouri. I wondered how long this trial would last and what would be the outcome. I had prayed that morning prior to leaving with my precious wife who had gone through so much with me. My son had been doing some better but still was requiring 24-hour care. I watched as Francis Mannion, my chief attorney, who would be representing me of the American Center for Law and Justice, and Todd Nielsen, the local Kansas City attorney, consulted with each other regarding the proceedings of the trial. There was the infamous survey which was given to each prospective juror. It asked each prospective juror questions like, do you believe homosexuality is evil? Do you believe homosexuals should be licensed as foster parents? Do you attend a mosque, church, or synagogue? The questions then were given the values of greatly disagree, mildly disagree, mildly agree, mostly agree, greatly agree. Those who were in the middle of the road were the ones that finally ended up being the jurors. In other words, it was a set-up deal. A tremendous amount of preparation went into the case. There were 40 witnesses that the state of Missouri wanted to use to testify against me. I now realize that this strategizing against me would end up being used in my favor to bring the verdict against the state of Missouri. The real issue in the case of Larry Phillips versus the state of Missouri had to do with my supervisors trying to do everything in their power to force or coerce me into doing something that went against my stated religious beliefs. She knew my position because I had made it clear. I had told her that I would do the home studies assessments and so on, but that I could not license, endorse, and place children with homosexuals. Later I was to find out that she had prepared an evaluation where she recommended that I be fired because of my religious beliefs. During the federal trial, the American Center for Law and Justice was seeking to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that my employer, the state of Missouri, through my supervisor, had discriminated against me. We showed that I was working in a hostile work environment and that the nature of my relationship with my employer changed dramatically from positive to negative when they found out that I would not license and endorse homosexuals as foster parents. We also showed the way that this same supervisor tried to build a case against me by criticizing everything about my work, whereas before the kind of thing just was not occurring. Whenever a lawsuit is brought against the Attorney General, the state represents it. The Attorney General had 3 attorneys fighting against us. I learned that one of the Attorney General's attorneys was also the chief counsel for the National Organization for Women, a very liberal organization that opposes most issues that the traditional family would stand for. I thought, what a contrast we have, her on the one side and the American Center for Law and Justice on the other. This truly was a spiritual battle for the hearts and minds of the people throughout the trial. The The state of Missouri wanted to portray me as a right-wing fundamentalist extremist. That would prove to be very difficult since I'd graduated from the University of Kansas with a major in psychology, that is, a live and let live kind of person, but now I had heard state witnesses trying to portray me as a narrow-minded bigot. Have you ever heard the saying, perception is more important than reality, fact? Well, the objective of the state of Missouri was to present a Larry Phillips that would create a negative perception with the jurors that I was a troublemaker who was indifferent to others' feelings, a person who would not get along with his peers, a person who was insubordinate with his supervisors. Todd Nielsen, my local attorney, as well as Frank Mannion, the American Center for Law and Justice attorney, masterfully dispelled these notions by calling my closest co-workers to testify on my behalf. These co-workers were very kind in their testimony and evaluation of me in the workplace. These same co-workers testified to the vengeance brought on me by the supervisors and others because of my faith-based beliefs. This was tremendously helpful in dispelling the perception that the state of Missouri was trying to set up. Even though we were the plaintiffs in the case, the Attorney General's office tried to posture in such a way as to present me as the defendant. I had to often remind myself during the trial that these people were not after the truth. Their main purpose was to win the case no matter what. My faith was really being tested, and I would call my wife during breaks during the day. I was beginning to feel like we were losing the case. The one side of the court was full of state's witnesses, defendants, and other sympathizers with the other side, whereas on my side of the court it was pretty much empty. The ACLJ had decided rightfully not to portray the case as a Christian battle against the state of Missouri by having all kinds of churches represented. They felt this would do more harm than good, so it was a pretty lonely place to be at. But we knew God was with us throughout the trial. The last day of the trial, it seemed as though things had taken a turn for the worse. The jury could not reach a decision. We're at a deadlock, an impasse that would last for hours. There was such a disagreement among the jury that you could hear them yelling at each other from the jury room. The jury sent back a question to the judge, how bad does it have to get before we tell you that we are a hung jury? She wrote them a note back, until there's physical violence. So the jury fought on. The defendants were celebrating in the defendants' room across from us. There was very much a party atmosphere. I remember calling Rosette, my wife, and telling her that I believed that we had lost the case. I had been told that the jury on the case was the most liberal Clinton-appointed judge ever, and that she had once worked in the Attorney General's office. I started putting things together in my mind and felt that it was a lost cause. My wife reminded me that if God wanted us to win the case, that nobody could help us from being victorious. The jury could not come to a decision, so the judge sent us home for the day. I arrived at the federal courthouse in Kansas City earlier than usual the next day. Finally, I was prepared for the worst. Yesterday's events had looked rather disappointing to say at least. The defendants had been laughing and joking and making loud remarks so that we could hear them in the plaintiff's room. I merely wanted to get today over with and get on with my life. I had prayed and asked God to give me the strength regardless of the verdict. It was still before 8 o'clock a.m. and I was surprised to see my supervisor come in very early into the court. She seemed to be very upset, and I was later to discover the reason. Events started to unravel very quickly when one of the juries requested a private meeting with the jury, which of course is forbidden as a part of the procedure. The juror stated that it was so important that she would risk being found in contempt, so the judge granted her request. Why had she been so persistent in requesting a meeting with the judge? Well, the night before, she had gone back to her motel room at the motel, and she was approached by the manager of that motel and asked if she was a juror on a federal case. She had been instructed, as had all the juries, not to talk about the case outside the confines of the court. She stated that she couldn't talk about it. The manager then proceeded and told her that she knew she was on the Phillips case and that my supervisor worked for the motel part-time in accounting, and everything she, the juror, could do to help her, my supervisor, would be appreciated. Folks, that's jury tampering. Of course, the judge was furious and made this information available to us. All of a sudden, the party spirit among the defendants was gone. A grave and almost funeral-like atmosphere prevailed over the courtroom. The supervisor was questioned regarding the incident. She began to cry, and now it seemed everything was going in our favor. What a change from the night before. I remember now my wife's prediction that if God wanted us to be victorious in this case, nothing would stop us from winning. We have a verdict. This was the announcement. What a feeling after all these months to know that the case was about to be decided once and for all. We quickly reconvened in the courtroom, and the verdict read, we find supervisor's name left out, guilty of discrimination against Larry Phillips. Even though the compensatory damages were not that much, I also received punitive damages, which were very rare to get in a case like this. I was delighted and so very grateful to God for intervening once more on my behalf. There was a tremendous burden that lifted from my shoulders when I heard the verdict being read. I knew that God was on the throne, causing the events of just the last evening to work on my behalf. So the case was over. I had a verdict in my favor. Now I could start my new life. That's what I thought, but I was ever wrong. But was I ever wrong? The battle was just beginning. Over 5 years before we'd actually get a settlement on this case, or I might have given up. I was terminated in November of 1996, and now the case was put to trial in 1999, but little did I know that we would be put through a long ordeal of appeals and waiting before the good Lord decided to put an end to this mess. As I walked out of the courtroom that evening, I was kind of numb. I had no idea that what I would have to go through. Months of waiting and even wondering if this verdict would be overturned. I felt a calmness that only God can give, but I still wondered why our nation had gotten itself in such a quandary predicament. Why had we allowed these in our society who are against morality, against principles, against the Ten Commandments of God, to get such a foothold over our culture and our educational system and even the workings in our government? I didn't look back as I passed the security desk of the federal courthouse. I just wanted to get in my car and go home to be with my family. Chapter 11, Waiting on the Lord. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing to him who is invisible. Hebrews 11:27. After several days following the trial, I received a startling call from my attorneys. The Attorney General's office was petitioning the judge to set the case aside. I couldn't believe my ears. Could the Attorney General's office do this? I mean, we had just gone through a full-blown federal trial and received a verdict against the state of Missouri from a federal judge, and now the Attorney General's office was asking the judge to set the whole case aside? In other words, make a decision that none of this was relevant? I found myself getting angry, depressed, disheartened, and even questioning God's purpose in the course of these latest events. It's easy to honor God when you're on the winning side, but when it seems like the whole world is turning against you, it's a natural response to start blaming. God reminded me through my wife and the precious Holy Spirit that He had prevailed for me before and He could do it again. Up to this time, I had been working as an outside salesman for a water purification company. It wasn't the easiest thing to get a professional position in social work, when all over the state and city the media had printed that I had sued the state of Missouri. Companies don't want to hire people who are litigious, and I was definitely viewed as litigious. While working at the water purification company, I discovered that the senior sales executive was an out-of-the-closet homosexual. As I stated earlier in my book, it had been discovered that one homosexual supervisor had named a video doll after me and was calling meetings during the day and placing curses on that video doll by poking pins into it. Just to show how unified the homosexual community is, the homosexual salesman stated in a meeting totally unrelated to my case, "I just want everybody here to know that I have a voodoo doll on my desk." The Holy Spirit prompted me to leave the meeting to go to the restroom. It was clear that I was supposed to respond to this latest attack of the evil one. I had a New Testament in my desk. I took it back into the conference, and when it came time for me to give my report, I stated, I just want everyone to know that I have a New Testament, and I'll put the Word of God up against a voodoo doll any day of the week. The response was immediate. The other salespeople started laughing and clapping. God does have a tremendous sense of humor. God shows His love for us in a most unusual way at times. He continued to bring people into my life to encourage me. I have found so many scriptures that give comfort during times of the darkest trials. I know that He truly is a father to the fatherless and a shelter in time of storm. My wife and I had been seeking medical treatment for my son, but nothing seemed to be working. My son is unable to cognitively process information during most of the day. Sometimes right after he wakes up, he's near normalcy for a couple of hours, but he goes downhill rather quickly. Mark shows us his love in the most significant ways at home. Sometimes he'll put his hand on my shoulder and say, I love you guys. This makes it all worthwhile. The doctor's visits and all the times of his utter confusion and all the sleepless nights. Love is the most powerful thing in the world. The love we show The love was shown to us by God sending His Son into a fallen world to redeem those whom He died for on a cruel cross. His suffering and dying was the ultimate example of His infinite love. To know that His mercy endures forever was a reminder for me to be patient and hold steadfast to the everlasting arms of God. I'm going to go ahead because the next chapter is very brief. It's chapter 12. It's entitled, The State of Missouri Seeks to Overturn the Jury's Decision and the Judge's Opinion. O my God, I trust in Thee. Let me not be ashamed. Let not mine enemies triumph over me. Psalm 25:2. What would the judge's response be to the state of Missouri's request to set my case aside? One never knows what's working inside a judge's head. I talked to Frank Mannion of the American Center for Law and Justice. He assured me that he felt good about the response to the state of Missouri's request. The judge's opinion didn't come back until several months later. It was in March of 2000, but her opinion was clear and 22 pages long. The highlights of what she said in her opinion was as follows. The court believes that a reasonable official would understand that it is unlawful to negatively appraise an employee's performance and recommend he be discharged because of his religious beliefs. Accordingly, the court finds sufficient evidence to support the jury's conclusion that, and it names my supervisor, acted with reckless indifference to Phillips' First and 14th Amendment rights. The judge went on to state in her opinion the jury found that the same person did everything in her power to adversely affect Phillips' employment. There is no evidence that she could have done anything more to adversely impact Phillips. Because Phillips' claim is that she withheld and violated his constitutional rights in her individual capacity, the court believes that her conduct is sufficient to sustain the verdict. Religion was a determining factor in her decision to write a negative performance appraisal and recommend that Phillips be fired. I had been warned by both my attorneys that just because the judge had now ruled in favor of the verdict of the jury, that would not stop the Attorney General's office from taking my case to the Federal Court of Appeals. So the question now is, would the Attorney General's office be content with the jury's verdict now and the judge's 22-page opinion, or would they continue to take the case on up to the 8th District Court of Appeals in St. Louis, Missouri? This was a federal appeals court for my area in Kansas City. At this point, I was not too surprised when I found out the state of Missouri had decided to take my case to the Court of Appeals. I would face another time of waiting. I was in hopes that this would inadvertently slow down the licensing of homosexual foster parents, not only in the state of Missouri but nationwide, especially if there were Christians in these decision-making positions. I also was in hopes that the case would help establish a precedent for other professionals who were being asked to do things that went against their religious beliefs because of their jobs. Teachers, Police officers, government workers, firefighters, and other public servants are asked to do things every day that fly in the face of their religious beliefs. Whether it's a social worker directed to take a teenage mother to a Planned Parenthood to get an abortion, or a school teacher being directed to teach evolution as a fact and not a theory, or the many police officers feel that they have to harass with social workers parents of children that are homeschooled, the challenge in this country is great. My hope is that this case might be used to reinforce the Christian in the workplace. Well, that's all I'm going to read for today. Tomorrow we'll go into chapter 13 when we have to go to the Court of Appeals. It was quite a long battle, and sometimes I was with a friend yesterday having lunch, and I said, here I am 71 years old and still reliving this event today after 29 years. May the good Lord be with you.